everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. This week we are discussing mindfulness, which gets a lot of attention, but not very many people really know what it does, what it is, and where it comes from. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So, mindfulness is the practice of purposely bringing your attention to experiences happening in the present moment without judgment, and it has been around for thousands of years. Almost every religion has some form of mindfulness practice like prayer, chanting, or meditation, and I learned this in my research, but a really interesting mindfulness practice that I came across was from the Sufi tradition of Islam, and people called the whirling dervishes spin around as part of a ceremony to recognize the connection with God and the world, and it's really cool, and I highly recommend looking up a video of the whirling dervishes, just like on YouTube or something. Early records of mindfulness practices come from the Hindu Vedic tradition, Buddhism, and from the Eastern Orthodox Church, which, in all fairness, did happen a couple of centuries later. But they all teach mindfulness as a way to experience truth and, in a religious sense, to experience God. Western mindfulness kind of started around the 1830s when transcendentalists like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson encouraged people to go outside, spend time alone in nature with no distractions, contemplating the true nature of the universe, which was kind of a split from the Protestant traditions happening in the country at that time that often stressed not having a personal relationship with God. So I was kind of a little bit radical at the time. Eastern mindfulness traditions were brought to the U.S. around the 1970s, and they mostly came from a man called Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, who studied under Buddhist teachers like Thich Nhat Hanh, and came back to America to found the mindfulness-based stress reduction program at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. This kind of represented the start of mindfulness as a generally accepted medical practice in the West, which is not to say that it wasn't already a part of traditional medicine systems like Ayurvedic medicine and Chinese herbal medicine. That's been going on for thousands of years in Eastern countries. Mindfulness is kind of a social media buzzword, especially in the wellness communities, but it is one that actually has evidence behind it, which is really awesome. Mindfulness practices in the West include breath awareness meditation, mindful eating, body scan meditation, and prayer, which is to be expected. Today, I'm going to take you through the scientific basis of mindfulness practice, tell you a little bit about how it can be helpful in treating and preventing various psychological and psychosomatic illnesses, and how you can incorporate it into your life. And if I'm feeling extra spicy, I might talk a little bit about cultural appropriation and appreciation, because there's a little bit of that going on in the topic of mindfulness. So studies on mindfulness are not as robust as studies in other fields like cancer, because the study hasn't been around as a scientific topic for so long, and a lot of studies rely on self-reported data such as your reported stress levels, your emotional state, which is not as reliable data, but of course some mindfulness studies are done using brain imaging techniques that will actually show the brain activity in certain parts of the brain, and that is the data that we are really going to dig into. Well, not really, because I'm not a neuroscientist and I can't completely give you all of the knowledge that you might be seeking. But I recommend looking at studies yourself. It's a very good way to learn about what the scientists are doing in various topics, and so you can build an opinion for yourself. So before we talk about mindfulness proper, we are going to talk about the nervous system, because mindfulness affects all of your body, but through the nervous system. So your brain is the main organ of the nervous system, and the nervous system itself is usually split into two main parts: the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, and the central nervous system, the CNS. The main specialized cell in this system is the neuron, which is adapted to send and receive messages in the form of electrochemical signals. We have three main types of neurons: sensory, interneurons, and motor neurons. Sensory neurons are found in your sensory organs, like the skin, ears, eyes, nose, and mouth, and their job is to take stimulus like pressure, heat, light, sound, taste, or smells, and convert it into those electrochemical signals. Send it off to other neurons via chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. You might know some. They're like adrenaline, serotonin, dopamine, and epinephrine, just to name a few. And the places where neurons meet and those electrochemical neurotransmitters go across are called synapses. Those will become important later. Interneurons carry the messages from sensory neurons to the brain, where a response is formulated, and then the brain sends that response back down through more interneurons to the motor neurons. And motor neurons receive those signals from the brain in a response to a stimulus, and they trigger a response from the muscles, making us move or talk or blink. Just respond to a stimulus. You might put your hand on a hot stove, and your sensory neurons will feel that heat and send that message through your interneurons to your brain, and your brain will send a message saying, take your hand off, back down through those interneurons, and the motor neurons will send a message to your muscles, and you'll pull it away. Well, that's kind of a bad example, because that's more of an example of a reflex arc, so the message wouldn't get quite to your brain. It'd go into your spinal cord, and then your spinal cord would take care of business. But that's generally how it works. And neurons are also found in the brain itself. The brain is split into a lot of different areas, each responsible for different areas of cognition, like emotion, proprioception, that's like balance and moving, and speech. Scientists used to think that after we reached a certain age, a little while after puberty, we would stop making new synapses, those connections between your neurons, which meant that your brain really wouldn't change. We now know that our brains can make new neural connections pretty much at any time in our life, and that quality is known as neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the formation of new neural connections and pathways, as we just said, and it allows us to learn, to change our habits, and meditation can help us do this. Neuroplasticity happens in two ways, and practicing mindfulness consistently over a period of time affects both of them. Mindfulness changes the brain's structure by helping it form new connections between neurons. This leads to long-term improvements in learning because there are more pathways for information to follow. A pretty straightforward example of these structural changes is one study showed that 30 to 40 minutes of mindfulness activity per day for a period of about 3 weeks was correlated with an increase in hippocampus gray matter mass, and gray matter is where you have most of the neurons. And the hippocampus is the area of your brain that is responsible for learning, storing memories, spatial orientation, and the regulation of emotions. And it also was correlated with an increase of temporal parietal lobe size, which is the area of your brain responsible for empathy and compassion. That same mindfulness activity also was related to a decrease in the size of the amygdala, which is the part, it's kind of like the quote-unquote reptile brain that deals with like your primitive responses to stress and emotion, pretty much your fight or flight response. So that pretty much means practicing mindfulness in this study showed that you had better, well, the people in the study who practiced had better learning capabilities, long-term memory, regulation of their emotions, felt more empathy and compassion, and had a dampened response to stress. Functional neuroplasticity is when normal thinking behaviors trigger more activity in a certain part of the brain, pretty much using different parts of your brain to solve the same problem. Pretty much, the more you use in an area of your brain, the easier it is to use again. Kind of like when you, I don't know, put a spoon back in the drawer in a certain place, and then you might start putting your spoon back there again and again until it becomes a habit. That's kind of the same thing happening in your brain. Mindfulness trains your brain to react without strong emotion, to notice details, and to focus for sustained periods of time. And when you use those areas of your brain, like putting a spoon back in a certain place, you can do that more easily again and again. So as you get better at mindfulness and you practice it more and more, those skills will transfer directly into your daily life, and you won't even have to really think about, like, ooh, I should be practicing gratitude right now. I should be more empathetic. It'll just kind of happen in this that's what this study says. And it's kind of common knowledge that meditating, doing yoga, other mindfulness activities reduce stress, but I'd kind of like to explain the why of all of that. And there are a few theories, but this is my favorite and the one that makes the most sense to my very not a neuroscientist self. Basically, pain is in the brain. And when you practice mindfulness, your brain learns to perceive stress and pain as less dramatic, so the brain doesn't react as intensely as we saw in that reduced size of the amygdala and the new thinking patterns. So your brain will take stress as less of an amygdala activity and more of a different part of your brain. So the levels of neurotropic factor kappa B, a molecule that is released during a biological stress response, are reduced in people who practice mindfulness. NFKB, that neurotropic factor kappa B, would usually trigger the production of a short-lived protein called a cytokine that carries messages to cells to start inflammation, and inflammation can cause pain in itself. It's not always a bad thing. It can really help you heal from injuries, but chronic inflammation and too much inflammation is painful and bad. And by regulating the emotional response to stress and pain using mindfulness, the brain doesn't react as much through that neurotropic factor cycle, and it leads to a dampened physical response to that pain and stress. So you perceive it less. It's still there, but your brain just doesn't care as much, really. And this property is really useful in treating people with chronic pain. If you train the brain to have less of an unpleasant response to pain, you will feel less pain. It's crazy. Meditation is also used as a treatment or in conjunction with other treatments for many mental illnesses like anxiety and depression. And it taps into the aspects of mindfulness that allow you to emotionally detach from your own thoughts and feelings and observe them without judgment. And by training the brain to do this, many symptoms of mental illnesses can be either completely resolved or partially, and the restructuring of the brain that happens, that increased hippocampus size, decreased amygdala size, makes this a pretty long-term solution. I've been talking about a lot of, quote, mindfulness practices, but I haven't really told you how to incorporate them into your life yet. So the basic idea of a mindfulness practice is to limit distractions like music, a lot of flashing lights, talking, smells, whatever might distract you. So pretty much put your phone